This is Electric Universe Eyes, and today I'm going to do a reading from the book God's Star by Dwardu Cardona. This is titled Perplexity. Roger Westcott recently wrote, "Ever since Greek philosophers first initiated critical examination of Homeric and Hesiodic myth, some mythologists have characterized myths in general as mad. As Wallace Budge stated of Egyptian texts, the perplexity of ancient beliefs confounded even those very ancients who professed adherence to them. Speaking especially of the antiquity of the so-called Book of the Dead, Budge informed his readers that there is no doubt that, quote, the greater part of these texts are far older than the period of the first historical king of Egypt. According to him, certain sections indeed appear to belong to an indefinitely remote and primeval time. Those who came later, however, did not always seem to have understood what the originals had alluded to, which is exactly the situation that Themis, in reproaching Thoth, had meant to emphasize. Quote, the earliest texts bear within themselves proofs, not only of having been composed, but also of having been revised or edited long before the days of King Mena, or Menes, and judging from many passages in the copies inscribed in hieroglyphics upon the pyramids of Unas and other early kings, it would seem that even at the remote date, the scribes were perplexed and hardly understood the texts which they had before them. Concerning a particular and very important chapter of the Book of the Dead, a chapter that has been considered an abridgment of the whole Book of the Dead, and basing his opinions on that of Chabas, Budge affirms that it was not only very ancient and very mysterious, but very difficult to understand, even 14 centuries before our era. Can we millennia later fare any better in our attempt to understand these texts? And is it merely Egyptian texts that will pose this problem for us? In speaking of the great epics of the Germans, the Indians, Finns, and other ancient peoples, Sigmund Freud claimed that the original cause behind these epics had already fallen into oblivion before the arrival of Alexander the Great, who himself lamented that he had no Homer to immortalize his deeds. Will we, so many centuries later, be able to ferret out the cause behind these epics? Of course, as anyone who has ever read anything about him knows, Freud had his own psychoanalytic beliefs in mind when he referred to ancient myths. As Richard Heinberg noted, proponents of the non-historical approach to myth interpretations are more or less forced not so much to explain myths as to explain them away. And despite what good can still be said of Freud's psychoanalytic methods, in the end, that is exactly what he did in his attempts to analyze the messages he believed to be contained in ancient myth. He ended up by explaining them away. Fortunately, as Heinberg also noted, the collective fantasy approach to myth in general is starting to lose ground. Thus, despite his own calling as a psychoanalyst, Theodor Reich had to admit that, quote, myths appeared to us at first as collective daydreams, as wish fulfillment of the masses. Such a characterization is still psychologically valid, but we apply today the interpretation of myths in hope of discovering at their depths precipitations or sediments of real historical events or situations. And to be sure, Reich, as well as others of his profession, are now of the professional opinion that, quote, the more widespread a myth, the more likely it is to have an historical basis, end quote. An example of the complexity of myth comes from the Egyptian papyrus of Ani, in which, among other things, the deity is made to utter the following words, quote, I am the Lord of the crown, I am in the eye, my egg, my seat is on my throne, I sit in the pupil of the eye. Definitely sounds like polar configuration. Now I ask you, what meaning can be extracted from the above? As the, quote, Lord of the crown, the deity can be understood as the crowned god. Thus he can say that his seat is on his throne. There is nothing enigmatic about a crowned god sitting on his throne. But what does it mean that the deity is or resides, quote, in the eye? Or that he sits, quote, in the pupil of the eye? What is this, quote, I in which the God resides? And why is the I equated with his egg? What has an eye to do with an egg? What is this egg anyway?
You know what? The egg shows up a lot in this sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Symbolism.
And yet, enigmatic as these words are, together with others pertaining to different themes, an in-depth study will reveal their coherence and even logic once the key to the symbolism behind them is understood.